warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyd's. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Conversations in Drug Development podcast here by Allen Boyd Consultants. I am your host, Eric Hardter. I'm a Director of Regulatory Affairs in our U.S. office, and I'm equally delighted to be joined here by another American, an Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs, Kelsey Lenoch. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thank you, Eric. Nice to be here.
So this is Kelsey's first podcast. How are you feeling?
Yes, good. Ready to dive into all things U.S.
And that is actually a really good segue, because I thought perhaps at the time it was somewhat jokingly. At the end of June, when I recorded a podcast with my colleague, Dr. Catherine Bowen, we said, maybe we'll check in another 90 days or so. There's probably going to be more U.S.-centric information. And lo and behold, here we are. It's been a busy 3 months, hasn't it?
It has indeed. We've seen the removal and return of Dr. Vinay Prasad.
And that was a big thing, because we did a little bit of a deep dive on him. He was a very interesting fit, especially in light of the appointment of Commissioner Marty Makary at FDA. And it was sort of questioned as to whether or not Dr. Prasad, the director at CBER, would fall in line. And the immediate answer was no, he wouldn't. And he left. It was citing family reasons. But then what happened then?
Just a mere 10, 11 days later, Dr. Vinay Prasad returns at the request of the commissioner. And since then, it's been a bit quieter. We haven't heard much.
Yeah, I took note of that as well. Again, sort of as alluded to, he was a bit of a lightning rod of controversy upon his appointment. And since that point, a couple of months now, roughly, we've really not heard a peep. So maybe just keeping their nose down, getting some good work done at the Center for Biologics.
Let's hope.
Now, how about the Center for Drugs? We have a couple of new appointments here. First of all, Dr. George Tidmarsh is the new CDER director. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, he seems like a fair pick for the selection of the new director. Has a background in biotechnology, leading as CEO in some companies, otherwise academic research, a physician, so scientifically based.
Yeah, and that's really what you're hoping for, I think, at the end of the day. It's so weird. I don't feel like I should be poking holes in the credentials, but after Dr. Prasad, you find yourself doing maybe these deep dives on some of the new appointments. But I agree. He's got the medical background. He's done industry. He's done academia. Clearly a very bright mind. And he also seems to be in line with Dr. Makary and sort of finding out what are some ways that we can maybe get drugs approved a little bit more quickly.
Mm-hmm. In addition, we also have a new deputy director at CDER, Dr. Mike Davis, and he's actually someone I'm familiar with. I've worked with Mike at a previous organization. Something I'll note in terms of Mike's past experience, he has previously done psychedelic research, most recently serving as the chief medical officer for a sponsor developing psychedelic drugs. So I just make note of that as we maybe look at other interests of the current administration in terms of seeking approval for those types of treatments.
And that was something, and again, you could probably agree and disagree with Robert Kennedy Jr.'s opinions, the Director of Health and Human Services, but that was a push, was the potential approval. And we know there's been a lot of research as of late into psychedelic treatment. So we'll have to sort of keep our tabs on that. Mm-hmm. And then one thing we talked about last time, it's not really related to people per se, maybe from a broader sense, was that the FDA had lost some of their numbers, unfortunately, which you never like to see. And of course, the question then becomes, is this going to result in any delays? And in terms of CDER and CBER, we've not really seen that yet. They're still hitting their marks, but interestingly enough, it's the Office of Orphan Products Development, where we've seen a couple of examples. I don't know if it's statistically significant just yet, but in recent months, we've seen them go a bit longer than their 90-day review turnaround timeline, almost 4 months in one example, over 5 months in another example, and actually to the point where in their responses, they're stating that they're short-staffed. So is this canary in the coal mine? What do you think? Is it maybe just a temporary issue?
One can hope it's temporary. I think the examples you've provided do start to, indicate maybe some slowdown. So I think we continue to pay attention to it. I think what's interesting is they are being transparent and citing those staffing issues. And with that, also not being transparent on timelines necessarily either, and indicating we'll get back to you in X number of days. So certainly concerning.
And again, these are human beings. They're doing the best they can. These things happen from time to time. But here again, we're just trying to make sure that we have the best understanding of current trends as possible. Well, this is actually kind of an easy segue from orphan product development into the recently announced rare disease evidence principles. And to me, I found this was interesting. I actually did a little bit of a deeper dive and posted a blog on the Boyd's website about it. Anything rare disease is always very interesting to me. Now, we'll get into a little bit of the nuance, but again, from a 10,000-foot view, I think we all agree, even if it is just kind of a press release at this point, anything that has the potential to get drugs into the hands of patients more quickly, particularly where there's an unmet need, that's a good thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So again, we'll have to see a little bit more as to how this is actually going to work in practice, but we do have some details. And in reading through, what I seemed to find was a little bit of almost like a borrowing of some maybe previously promulgated guidance, specifically those focused on rare disease development, also that on the use of a single pivotal trial for determining an IMP's risk-benefit profile. And I'm sort of wondering, is this just kind of a repackaging? And then they get into the concept of how important it is to meet with the regulators. And this is what this RDEP will allow for as well. But Kelsey, we're already doing that, right? Particularly in the rare disease space.
Right. That's what one would expect. And so if anything, if this was sort of an unwritten rule and now it's in writing, but certainly important in rare disease to get advance agreement and alignment in terms of what those endpoints are going to be. And this program certainly highlights just that.
Yeah, and so I'll be honest, I'm at this point in the press release, I'm feeling a little bit cynical. I'm thinking this is just something that false hope is not the way I would put it for sure, but I'm just thinking, is this really anything new? But then I start to see some signal in the noise. And the first thing that I would like to note is that this was born out of the FDA's Rare Disease Innovation Hub, which is a joint CDER venture. That's really important to me. I think folks have probably seen before, if you've worked across multiple products, across the centers, if you've had meetings with those regulators, it's not that they're not on the same page, but different people have the ability to say different things. And that could probably introduce some confusion, right?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And so I imagine then too, both in highlighting the need to meet with those regulators, you're now hopefully getting consensus in terms of expectations across both divisions.
Yeah, consistency and transparency, I think, are the two buzzwords that I agree. It's exactly as you said, getting that consensus. Even more important to me, though, was I think they kind of took the FDA's established definition of a rare disease, which is maybe thought about more with what we talked about previously, the orphan drug designations, and parsed out from there what I would call the ultra-rare disease, something that's potentially impacting 1,000 or fewer. I've worked in this space. There can be some serious challenges, even right down to the point of how many patients are there. And if you don't have a lot of patients, and then you take the subset of those who might actually be eligible for a clinical trial or interested in a clinical trial, it becomes very difficult to run said clinical trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for FDA to draw this out and say, we need solutions for these populations, that was really important to me. I don't know, again, what it's actually going to look like practically, but if you're meeting with them during the IND phase and potentially have stakeholders who might not have been otherwise present, or maybe they're willing to make the timeline shorter or give you more meetings, similar to like a breakthrough therapy designation. Again, we'll need to see how this shakes out, but anything that draws light here, I think, is always a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's kind of another segue here. It's almost like we designed this rationally, right? You think about rare diseases, you think about potential novel endpoints. Well, let's think about that from an oncologic perspective as well. And I'm trying to remember, it may have been the first Conversations in Drug Development podcast that Boyd's did. And it was Dr. Catherine Bowen, Dr. Julie Warner, where they talked about the change over the past few years in oncology medications, went from that, what I would call that blunt force cytotoxic profile, into the more molecularly targeted medicines. And naturally, as you kind of see that, you might start to think, okay, are we going to be looking at different endpoints? And then, of course, the question becomes, what is the agency's appetite for looking at an unvalidated endpoint and maybe seeing that through?
That's right, Eric. And the FDA and American Association for Cancer Research, they recently held a joint meeting in early September on novel endpoints for drug development. What are the takeaways?
Yeah, it was an interesting meeting for sure. And not surprisingly, they started out with the concept of overall survival. And as you know, Kelsey, they're still using that as the gold standard, right?
Right. But are there any limitations?
There are, and they're fairly standard. It's a black and white endpoint, right? And because you're looking at one of two possible outcomes, this might necessitate a large sample size. Interestingly enough, if you have a really efficacious drug, it could even lengthen the time of follow-up, thereby taking longer to get medicines in the hands of patients.
Sure. So I guess in that light, do you really see this spurring development in the rare disease space?
I think so. I don't think overall survival is going away. FDA did just have a fairly recent draft guidance come out wherein they provided some statistical and trial considerations. And even there, they noted there's an appetite to move away from OS as a primary endpoint for efficacy. But even still, they want it tracked in the clinical trial, even if it's just ultimately going to add to the safety database. But I do think that, as was, I think, prevalent in a lot of the speakers, both FDA and industry, they did see some potential development being spurred in the rare disease space. Again, as we just noted, rare and ultra-rare diseases might require some novel mechanisms of proving efficacy.
That's right, Eric. But what about post-license requirements?
Yeah, it's possible they become more burdensome. We know that if you have something like a surrogate endpoint and you're not proving all the way that your risk-benefit profile is acceptable, there could be some additional work that you have to do after you gain licensure. And I think it's kind of interesting because we talked about George Tidmarsh earlier, the director at CDER, and he actually, just within the last couple of days, opined on LinkedIn that, sort of reading between the lines, you got the sense that he wasn't a huge fan of surrogate endpoints. He sort of picked a couple of examples where he said that drugs received approval based on surrogate endpoints, but then with real-world data, it found out they weren't working very well. So I don't think he was signaling a lack of openness to them per se. He was just saying that, again, reading between the lines, there could be some expectations of what you're going to need to show at the time of licensure, which, of course, can be de-risked by meeting with FDA along the way.
Right.
I will say, though, one of the examples that they brought up at this conference was Ojjaara by GSK. This is a treatment for myelofibrosis, and they spoke about the fact that the primary endpoint was a bespoke subjective assessment called the Myelofibrosis Symptom Assessment Form Total Symptom Score. And that is, as it sounds, it's an aggregate, but it was created with buy-in from investigators, from regulators, from patients, from patient advocates. So we love using the phrase clinically meaningful. This is getting you exactly that. It's the patients telling you how they're feeling. They even backed it up with a key secondary endpoint, the splenic response rate, which it's not that it was novel per se, but it had also not really been used in terms of providing confirmatory evidence for efficacy. So when you mention predicate examples as regulators, to me, it's sort of showing maybe this isn't exactly going to be your explicit blueprint, depending on your drug, your population, et cetera, but more, maybe these are the types of things that you can start to think about when coming up with new endpoints.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about coming up with endpoints, we also want to think about eventual standardization of those endpoints as well, which is reasonable in principle, but practically speaking can be challenging when you start to try to implement those across multiple sites and ensuring accuracy and capturing that data.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And there, as is often the case at these types of conferences, there were industry stakeholders, the audience was asking questions, and they talked about exactly this and just what might that lift look like. A lot of data points, a lot of training across sites, and a lot of potential calibration of instrumentation. And when we think about clinical trials, it's, do we have the patients to support this? And then, of course, from the sponsor perspective, do you have the time and money to support this? It's the pie in the sky. It's what everyone wants, but it's exactly as you said, it might be somewhat tricky to do so.
So what about circulating tumor DNA? I know in recent years there was a guidance document issued on this. Did it come up at all in the joint meeting?
It did. It actually had its own segment, and they had some speakers from experience with colorectal cancers, lung cancers, lymphoma. Just for our listeners who might not know, if when a tumor dies, the circulating tumor DNA, or ctDNA for short, is released into the bloodstream, and this subsequently becomes a potential biomarker to track. And as you said, there's been guidance promulgated by the agency, but there's also been a lot of sponsor interest in using this as a potential endpoint. I hate to say the FDA kind of threw cold water, ice cold water. If you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge, it was sort of like that for endpoints. And this is just for now, of course, but they're saying it's probably nowhere close to being utilized as a primary endpoint of efficacy. However, in some of these retrospective analyses that they did, they were actually able to show a lot of examples where in a post hoc analysis, they could, in these 3 cancers that I mentioned, help identify high-risk patients who might be best served with a new medicine, even if it wasn't ultimately going to be used as an approvable endpoint. So progress is being made. It's kind of as we just said about standardization. It's going to take time. It's going to take sponsor money. It's going to take patience. And it's probably going to take more blood draws and analyses than sponsors are really feasibly able to do at this point in time during the investigational life cycle. So let's pivot now to something that I thought was pretty interesting. I thought it was a bit of a hot button, which I'm sure we'll touch on, right? It was maybe the second phase of the FDA saying that they were going to release complete response letters from drug approvals that were denied. And in phase 1, I think there was a lot of public outcry. Folks felt, well, wait a second, we already had all this before, didn't we? What have you shown us that's new? In this phase 2, what did you see? How did it differ from phase 1? What is the potential impact here?
I think what really stands out to me is what was included with these is, as you said, it's for drug applications or biologics that were not approved, are not yet approved. And so this is quite transparent. From FDA's point of view, it's a way to demonstrate modernization and transparency with the public. But certainly for those companies, it's in some ways airing their dirty laundry.
I'm hearing pros, cons. Do you have a pros, cons list?
There's your cons, certainly. I think a pro could, from any sponsor's point of view, if there's awareness of a certain program or novel type of therapy, viewing and reviewing those complete response letters can be certainly telling in terms of what those gaps are. Like I said, especially for something novel. Other than that, I think at a very high level, there's often, the common things we see in complete response letters: quality, CMC issues, efficacy, data is lacking. Eric, what about your thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting because you take a step back and you use the word novel a lot. When I think about novel, I think about the originator. And so if I'm an originator and there are competitors potentially nipping at my heels, and now there's, of course, a likely heavily redacted version of a roadmap, but a roadmap nonetheless, I'm thinking to myself, I went through all this time, money, effort, and now folks behind me have the potential to come along and maybe expedite things. Of course, we know that there's going to be exclusivity, there's going to be patent law, there is going to be a certain time phasing element to this. But if you're the originator, are you kind of saying this is dirty pool?
Yeah, I think time will tell if we likely start to see maybe some lawsuits generate from this, or just how much is actually unveiled in the issuing of future complete response letters. Certainly a new idea for FDA to be issuing these at this stage.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we think about this from the patient perspective, and we know that the concept of generic drugs and biosimilars helps drive a less burdensome approach to patients being able to get medications, driving costs down. So from that perspective, again, acknowledging that whether it's exclusivity or patent, there's still going to be a certain amount of time that the innovators are going to have the whole market to themselves. I do think that being able to help price control is always going to be good for patients. Now, interestingly, we saw an example of industry pushing back. Do you want to describe this a little?
Yes. So I picked up that Capricor Therapeutics, in somewhat of a bold move, actually issued their response to FDA's complete response letter, sort of in, they're following suit and demonstrating transparency as well. So what was interesting in this is it clearly shows, in this case, Capricor's experience with FDA leading up to the submission of the NDA and the multiple times they aimed to align with FDA and ensure everything was as expected once that NDA application was submitted. And so in many ways, it kind of demonstrates and highlights FDA's moving the goalpost, which we experience sometimes. But I did find that interesting and can't help but wonder if we'll see more of this.
It's an interesting concept, right? Potential competitors kind of banding together to show, okay, if you're going to air our dirty laundry, we can sort of do the same thing. And it's interesting. You can view it as antagonistic. I don't. I guess I kind of just view it as the same type of thing that sponsors are now saying, well, hey, we're trying to do what we thought were in our marching orders, and this might not have been an example of that. Anything that just gives this global transparency where possible, I think is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
For now, it probably just seems petty.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're at an N of 1. Maybe the N will increase in size, but it's not like it would be the first time that we've seen industry stakeholders band together.
Right.
So we touched on this a little bit. Were there any other examples that you would like to discuss in your perusal of the complete response letters?
Yeah, well, as mentioned, I think these complete response letters can be particularly helpful if you're familiar with a certain drug or type of therapy that recently has submitted their application. And I am familiar with one such case, that's Lykos Therapeutics. In my previous lifetime, I worked in psychedelic research, and this is one that I was following closely. Lykos, back in 2024, had submitted their NDA. It was slated to be likely the first approved psychedelic drug approved in the US. And in June of 2024, they had their public advisory committee meeting, which did not go too well. So there was some insight in that meeting of maybe what some of the issues could be for FDA to approve this. And it is clearly demonstrated in the complete response letter to see that in writing exactly what those issues are. In this case, we're talking about novel therapies. Psychedelics presents a number of different challenges in terms of administering that therapy and reviewing that complete response letter. Things like within your clinical trials and your eligibility criteria, looking at prior use of the drug itself. And in this case, we're talking about MDMA. So not the case for all new investigational drugs, maybe not likely that patients have prior use. But when it comes to generalizability of the drug, that becomes an important factor. And you want the number of patients enrolled to largely reflect the current use on a domestic scale in terms of what that percentage is. And in this case, there was an imbalance in that with Lykos and the patients that they enrolled in their trials. So just to summarize, I think right now, while the complete response letters and the PDFs are available, it's also the data set is available on Open FDA. So you can do a bit of data mining. However, I'll note that currently the data isn't structured in such a way that without some advanced coding experience, it may be difficult. So again, if you're familiar with a certain drug or biologic that's recently been approved, just tracking down just that company's name or the NDA number can be a helpful way to glean some insight, possibly.
Yeah, and so we talked here about the regulator's perspective, industry's perspective. As a regulatory affairs professional, I'm thrilled. Right?
You're right.
This is a great resource.
Yes, definitely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, especially considering it's only been about 3 months since the last iteration of the US FDA updates. But there were a couple of other things, maybe a couple of quick hitters here. Last time we talked about the National Priority Voucher Program. Were there any updates there? It was still sort of, again, that press release type thing.
Yes, and it somewhat is. FDA has added a bit more information. If you just Google Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, the website is updated. So now they've given a bit more detail about what the eligibility criteria is, as well as how to apply. Spoiler alert, it's just a very simple statement of interest. I think perhaps limited to 250 or 350 words. So seemingly a straightforward application process. So more details on the FDA website.
And then how about the FDA's Pre-Check process that they've recently introduced? This is a new one.
This is new and also quite interesting. So Pre-Check program, just briefly, this is really targeted towards U.S. drug manufacturers looking to promote and accelerate domestic manufacture of pharmaceuticals. This is in line with an executive order signed by President Trump. And so this is just an example of the commissioner following through on those orders. Coincidentally, as we're recording this, there is a public meeting on this program occurring today. So we don't have too much details about this. Perhaps more to come out of that meeting happening today. But yes, another new program offered by FDA.
Yeah, more to come with that, and undoubtedly more to come perhaps in another 3 months. That would actually put us at the end of December. So hoping it's more like the Red Ryder BB gun and not a lump of coal in the stocking. We're hoping for some really positive regulatory news over the next couple of months. And again, it's said lightheartedly, but there have been a lot of changes. Again, the new administration is still kind of in its nascent affairs here. And so these folks are still putting their stamp on some of these new programs, processes, potentially drug approvals, rejections. And as always, we're going to be ensuring that we're keeping our finger on the pulse there. Mm-hmm. So Kelsey, thank you. How was your first podcast?
It was good. Fun talking about the U.S. and what's going on. So maybe another one in the future.
Sounds great. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for once again listening to this episode of Conversations in Drug Development. And we will hopefully speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Boyd's. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.